Welcome everyone back to Mind Games with Garen Emig, a weekly production on the Sellout Crowd Network. I am Garen, columnist, podcaster for selloutcrowd.com. Thank you very much for tuning in. Going to talk about a story, not a subject, but a story that was written and posted on Sellout Crowd in the past week that is getting a lot of attention for very good reasons. It's Sam Hutchens' story on the time that Toby Keith coached an elementary football team in Norman to a dynasty. And it was real, and it was really quite beautiful, as most youth sports stories are. Sam did a terrific job with it, and you're going to love his recollection of that piece and his detailing it for you. First, so let's thank the sponsors of Mind Games, this show, and others. Two Fellas Movers, MidFirst Bank, the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, FireLakeJobs.com, Next Gen Roofing, 988 Oklahoma's mental health lifeline, and your Oklahoma Ford dealers. Drive into your best in Oklahoma Ford dealers today for the best deals on Ford's full lineup of trucks and SUVs. Ford is the best in Oklahoma. Sam, good to see you again, buddy.
Garen, thanks for joining me. I love talking about this story. It's just so fascinating and a little absurd when you read the headline. It seems unreal, but it's crazy how talking to these folks who are now roofers in Tulsa, or, one guy builds pools, a banker in Houston, and all these guys played for Toby Keith. It's crazy.
Played football for Toby Keith when they were at Roosevelt Elementary in Norman, correct? This is the genesis of your story about how Toby coached this elementary school football team in Norman once upon a time.
Yeah, I'll give you the nut graph. He coached for 5 years in the Norman Optimist League, which is... Okay. Just from what folks told me who grew up there and played in it, it's just the local rec league in Norman. There was about 8 other coaches, so 30. If you imagine 30 kids a team and 9 teams in the league, and just youth football that so many people in our country can relate to. But a few of these guys, I heard it funniest put like this. Someone said, "I was in a job interview last month, and I had the hands down best fun fact about yourself is." He said, "My youth football coach was Toby Keith," and everyone's jaw dropped a little bit. So it's just a little bit of a crazy story that originated in Norman.
Let's dig into it. Let's think about this. Show is called Mind Games, so we're going to think about Toby Keith and dimensions beyond his impact again on his music fans. It touches all sorts of folks in the state, and in particular, right, Sam reaches sports. His fandom for the Sooners, well documented. We had a lot of material about that. Barry Trammell wrote a terrific column after his recent passing on selloutcrowd.com. You can still see that. Eli Letterman covered an OU angle as well. What you got into was his if his heart and his passion was the Sooners, it didn't just stop there, right? I mean, if it might have started there, but it certainly trickled down into the ranks of kids. And this is the case with the Mud Dogs, where he didn't just give them shirts and uniforms. They didn't just put his likeness on a jersey, right? He wasn't like the sponsor of the uniforms. He was the coach. This was real.
That's right. And the ultimate impetus for this is Toby's son, Steelen, was on the team. Mm-hmm. And Steelen, of course, he grew up in Norman, friends with a lot of even OU connected people. Another kid on the team was Joe Castiglione Jr., the son of the OU athletic director. So it's kind of fascinating how those worlds intertwine. But yeah, Garen, Toby was not some token coach. And that's what all these guys, when I call them up 20 years later, that was one of the first things that they wanted to point out is Toby was drawing up plays. He was the originator of the wishbone offense that they ran. They had one pass play, and it was pretty lethal, which we can get into. But yeah, Toby was running drills. He was the guy making the kids do up downs when they misbehaved, as fifth graders do. He was the guy running the drills, running Oklahoma drills, in charge of as much discipline as you can get into. And they said he was a kind coach. But kind is, just like all football coaches can be. You can be kind, but you can be stern too. So that's what Toby was.
It sounds like if Toby spent a lot of time around OU football icons, coaching icons like Bob Stoops and Barry Switzer, it sounds like he did them proud. They won, right?
That's right. I had a line in the story. I said, memories fade. A consensus is impossible about, players can't exactly remember, but what I gathered is most people believe the Roosevelt Mud Dogs only lost 1 or 2 games in the 5 years that Toby coached. And I got a photo from one of the players who has 3 little championship trophies to prove just how much they won. But yeah, they were fantastic.
That's man, that really is following up on. I mean, you're going to do it. This is what Stoops or Switzer tell him, right? You're doing it for time, interest, and impact, but you might as well win along the way. And that's the word dynasty in your headline.
That's right. It wasn't there in vain. And they had kind of one advantage, Garen, over everyone else. I assume Toby, could have pulled more strings, or from what I understand, the teams were compiled via a draft. So, it was a little muddled with friends. We're still allowed to play with friends, exactly. But it was kind of, get together at the start of the year and draft kids. But Toby didn't pull any strings really in that department. But the Mud Dogs did have one advantage, and that was Toby, from his own personal finances that I imagine some other coaches around the league didn't have. Toby hired a film crew to come out and video every game, and this is back in the DVD era, video every game and put it on DVDs. So at the end of the season, the Mud Dogs, every player would get a package of DVDs from their games that now they're treasured keepsakes and a very cool piece of, personal history. But back then, Toby would have those guys watch the DVDs for film. And one player told me, people accused us of cheating because we were filming. But of course, there's nothing against the rules. You don't design rules with the coach in mind, with the affluence of Toby Keith to bring out a film crew. But the Mud Dogs watched film. They certainly did.
Wow. Okay, you mentioned one in particular, one Mud Dog in particular, whose name is going to ring a little bit of a bell, right? Not just for Toby Keith fans, but college sports fans. That's Joe C. Jr., Joe Castiglione Jr. What was, do you remember his specific recollection of that experience?
Joe was great. He was the first Mud Dog I talked to. And my eyes lit up when Joe, of course, said, "Hey, Joe, do you know any still teammates that I could talk to?" And Joe said, "Yeah, we're still really close." And so Joe had known a lot of the teammates. The Mud Dogs stayed in close contact. And something that Joe told me that sticks out in my mind is, he said, and this quote made it in the story, he said something like, on its face, it sounds a little absurd to say Toby Keith was my elementary school football coach. But if you actually knew Toby Keith, which Joe C. certainly did, he said, it's not absurd at all. It makes a ton of sense, because he said, if you knew Toby, that's what he loved to do, is just be around his son, be around football. It was kind of the perfect avenue for him. And so he said, it's not absurd if you know Toby. And that was a sentiment kind of echoed among other people. They said, hey, if you grew up in Norman in, the mid 2000s, 2004, 2008, that era, it wasn't crazy to say, hey, I met Toby Keith. I saw him at a restaurant, or I saw him at a bar or something. He was a part of that community. So it sounds crazy from the outside to read that headline and stuff, but the true sentiment of it is Toby, he was just an involved guy in the Norman community in a way that not a lot of megastars are.
I can vouch for that, Sam. I was raising 2 elementary age kids of my own during the Mud Dogs' rise to prominence. They went to Monroe, not Roosevelt, but even they heard a little bit about the exploits of the Mud Dogs. It's not a big enough town that word doesn't get out, right? When Toby Keith is building a youth football dynasty. So yeah, I can vouch for that. How many players do you think you chatted for this? 6, 7, 8? I mean, you were pretty deep, right?
I think it was 8 when it was all said and done.
8. Yeah. Wow. And they're all, most of them are still around here? Or are we talking everywhere?
It was interesting. I think the furthest guy was in Arkansas, who it's cool to see these connections, like 20 years later. Like I said, I talked to these guys when they're 7 years old or so, and now they're all 27. And one guy, a guy named Mike Mayberry, he now works for a company that Toby Keith bought last year in Arkansas, Lucky Stragglers. So it was just cool to see how, these connections kind of last years later. But yeah, the Mud Dogs, some of them are bankers in Houston. I talked to one guy who builds custom pools in Tulsa, and but they're joined by the fact that Toby Keith coached their team.
All great youth coaches give the kids nicknames, right? They do two things. They give the kids nicknames. They take the kids to Brahms for ice cream after the game.
Well, the Mud Dog spot, and this was something on the cutting room floor. The Mud Dog spot was Cici's. That's what they said. Even
yeah,
Toby,
of course, with the game room. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Even Toby, he would go to Cici's, and that was the spot. I'd say win or lose. They really didn't have much losses to contend with, but that was the Mud Dog spot was Cici's.
See, now I'm picturing a couple of Mud Dogs with sad faces wandering over to the adult table and asking Coach Toby, "Hey man, the claw's not working. I'm not getting what I want with the claw at Cici's. You got to help, man. You've got to come through for me." So Toby getting a big smile on his face as he goes to work the claw at Cici's for one of his Mud Dog linemen. Man, but okay, so that was the spot after games or after wins is in this case. The nickname party took care of too, though. I saw that there were those known not just by Mike, Steve, Bill, and Jim, but nicknames too. That was pretty sweet.
Yeah, I thought the funniest one. I talked to a converted linebacker. He didn't start playing linebacker for Toby Keith, but a player told me he got bigger later. So when he started playing Pee Wee football, he was 70 pounds, but he wrestled. So Toby Keith told him, "Hey, we need a new middle linebacker. Go get out there." So he was a 70 pound kid playing against some kids who were over 100 pounds, but his nickname was Kneecap Breaker. So that's what Toby called him, and I think K Dog was one. So yeah, Toby, he had the nicknames that are in the pocket of every football coach.
And you referenced this earlier, Sam. No surprise that the wishbone was a feature in terms of the Mud Dogs football. This being Norman, this being Toby, and his direct connection to Barry Switzer. That part didn't surprise me. The thing that jumped out in terms of strategy that blew me away was the Mud. It wasn't Jalen Hurts and the Eagles who invented the Tush Push. It might have been the Mud Dogs.
I guess, yeah. Is
that right?
It was funny. One of the players, Mike Mayberry, actually, his dad was a coach on the team too, and he told me the Mud Dogs, they'd oftentimes draw some accusations or some ire for other teams for pushing the envelope, or sometimes they'd run a play that they knew was legal that maybe not even the refs knew was legal. So Toby was always kind of on the edge, pushing those rules, and he said, yeah, they had a quarterback sneak play, which he likened to the tush push that the Eagles run, but the Mud Dogs were running that 20 years ago.
He really was taking this seriously. Clearly, this was not. Hey, I'm going to give you the license to, if you want a pump up song for pregame calisthenics stretch, you can play "Should Have Been a Cowboy" or something like that. I'm not going to charge you. Or this was a lot deeper than that, right? This was real time and energy, and it was just awesome to learn.
Yeah, it was awesome to learn how involved he was and how much he treasured, even those trophies that the Mud Dogs won. And what's cool, something else that Joe told me, Joe Castiglione Jr. He said, because he stayed tight with Toby, of course, being OU linked, and he said, man, even years later. Of course, when I'm talking with Toby, like you bring up the Mud Dogs, we love talking about the Mud Dogs together. And Joe said there were players that he'd long forgotten that Toby Keith could recall like that. He just knew his roster, he knew his boys, and he knew those nicknames. So that was cool to see that even years later, Toby he thought about the Mud Dogs.
And that's something anyone, again, who's ever invested any time in a youth sports team, no matter the sport, no matter the gender, no matter the location, it stays with you. It really, I mean, trust me, I did it with, again, my kids in Norman, not football, not in Toby's league, but you do remember everybody and everything. And the thing that's great, Sam, is that there comes a time later where you discover that the impact was twofold. It wasn't just the things you remember about them, it's the things that they remember about you. And I loved the passage of your story where some of the Mud Dogs popped in on Toby at an event right? And
Yes.
sort of took it over because of how glad the coach was to see his players again.
That was running back Trace McGee who told me that story. Trace was the last player I talked to, and I'm so glad I did. Something that one time Eli Letterman told me, a Sellout Crowd colleague who's also a friend. He said, hey, it always pays off to make that last phone call. This was certainly the case here because Trace told me a cool story about, he was at a benefits night. Toby was hosting one in Norman, and he said, as with benefits night where Toby Keith is the star, big names are milling around, and it's a fancy deal. But Trace said, me and a couple other Mud Dogs, we decided to pop in. We wanted to say hi to Toby. And he said, as soon as we got to Toby kind of shut the night down. Like he didn't cancel the party or anything, but Toby said, you guys are with me. And they hung out the rest of the night with Toby Keith. So yeah, it's a team, like you said, Garen. It's a team that, sure, they won their trophies in 2005, but years later, it's a team that Toby and certainly those boys treasure.
Yeah, and again, when we lost Toby a week ago, and everyone thought about the impact, it was again a reflex to the musical talent that he lent, songs that people are going to listen to the rest of their lives. The second thing you're going to think of is specific to Norman and OU. Watching him you see him on the sidelines at an OU Texas game at the Cotton Bowl, right? Or you see the old chair that he had beneath the basket at Lloyd Noble Center for basketball games. But it really does go beyond that. Your story is an example for Norman, and what's cool is that the work that your twin brother Ben did with regard to another piece on the night that Toby took over Eskimo Joe's, right after a Bedlam basketball game with Barry Switzer, showed that this wasn't just limited to the influence and the impact on OU. This was sort of a statewide thing, and if it wasn't exactly a love affair in Stillwater, it could be one if he showed up on any given night after a Bedlam game.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and you're right, Garen. Ben wrote a great story. I think the day or two after we lost Toby, and kind of recaptured that moment for Stillwater fans. I was a student at the time there, and I remembered that night. It was crazy where words started to filter out. Yeah, Toby Keith in Stillwater, and I think Toby Keith has kind of an odd relationship with Oklahoma State because yes, he's an ardent fan of OSU's arch rival, but he also pinned and sang the kind of anthem of Oklahoma State, Should Have Been a Cowboy, that they play after Bedlam. So Toby Keith is associated with good things there. And also there's just a ton of country music fans, Toby Keith fans at Oklahoma State. So it's fascinating. But yeah, he went to, I think it was Outlaws is the bar. I'm not an expert on the strip there, but Keith and Switzer, even in Stillwater, they were beloved and could have a good time, which I think shows what he did for this state. We see that water tower. We drive by it all the time, home of Toby Keith, and one of those deals that kind of makes you a little more proud to be an Oklahoman, I think.
Well, it's perspective, isn't it? You see the water tower if you motor up and down 35, and I know I've seen it 1,000 times in my life, and you think, oh, okay, that's kind of cool, but then you take it for granted, just like you take it for granted when you see him at Lloyd Noble the hundreds of times that I did. Well, that's just what he does, right? I mean, it's just that's sort of the fabric of life when it comes to living in Norman and going to OU games. You hear his music, you even see a red Solo cup, and you think, well, yeah, that's Toby Keith, but it really hits. After someone passes and you are left with not just like a water tower or a symbol or the lyrics to a song, but impact. And that's exactly what your story covered. Really beautifully done, Sam. You should be proud of it. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't read it yet to check it out on our selloutcrowd.com site. I would encourage anyone who hasn't read your brother Ben's story to read about the night that Toby sang Should Have Been a Cowboy at Eskimo Joe's. And then I think did a little karaoke across the street at Georgia Stables. I think that was right, part of your brother's story. Barry's column was terrific, encapsulated again Toby's love affair with the Sooners. And then there's Bob Stoops, who is closer to Toby than any of the rest of the staff at Sellout put together. Bob had a touching episode of Conversations with Coach recently where he remembered some of the fondest times and moments he shared with Toby Keith that, again, goes a lot deeper than just standing on the sideline at Bedlam or the Texas game or in Miami at the Orange Bowl. It's really good stuff, and something that everyone ought to take time and have imprinted, because it doesn't matter what you thought of Toby Keith's music or anything else, impact is still a very, very big deal. That's universal. And that was the case with this icon. So good work, Sam. Thank you very much for coming on and talking to me about it, man.
This was fun, Garen. Thanks so much.
That'll do it for this episode of Mind Games. A special thanks to producer Jacquelyn Musgrove and creative director Michael Lane for their help with this episode and others. I'll be back soon with another show. Please, until then, stay warm and stay safe and enjoy your day.